A horrifying truth, buried for over a century by local authorities, lies in the remote hills of eastern Oregon, silenced for decades by official suppression. Between 1852 and 1888, along a 20-mile section of the Oregon Trail, over 800 pioneers vanished. The cause wasn't disease or accidents, it was something far more sinister. The Sacred Heart Chapel, a simple wooden structure that offered hope to dying travelers, was in reality the epicenter of the most methodical mass murder scheme in American frontier history. What started as isolated disappearances escalated into a family enterprise, so ruthlessly calculated and efficiently executed that it fundamentally redefined the nature of evil. The Grayson family didn't merely kill for financial gain. They elevated it to a perfection, an art form, diligently maintaining records of every life they extinguished, every family they annihilated, and every ambition they interred in shallow graves. Before we plunge into the darkness that consumed the Grayson family and their victims, I have a request. This channel isn't for a general audience, it's only for those brave enough to confront the most disturbing truths concealed within America's past. If you are among the few who can withstand these dark revelations, subscribe now and tell me what state you're listening from in the comments. Your support is crucial, helping us to uncover the stories others are too afraid to tell. Now, let's travel back to 1852, a time when the Oregon Trail promised hope but delivered horror. The path of hope and peril. The Oregon Trail stretched across the American frontier like a lifeline, transporting dreams westward across 2,000 miles of relentless wilderness. For the thousands of families who had liquidated all their assets for a chance at a new life, every mile was a blend of hope and extreme peril. Disease, starvation, and natural disasters were constant threats, claiming countless lives. However, in the rolling landscape of eastern Oregon, death presented a deceptive countenance, one that offered a smile of Christian compassion while simultaneously assessing the worth of a family's possessions. The year 1852 marked the peak of Oregon Trail migration, with over 50,000 people enduring the treacherous journey west. By the time most wagon trains reached the Blue Mountains of Oregon, they had already completed nearly 1,800 miles. Families were utterly exhausted, supplies were critically low, and the most vulnerable members were frequently succumbing to dysentery, trail fever, and other ailments that transformed aspirations of prosperity into desperate battles for survival. It was against this backdrop of extreme vulnerability that Father Murray Grayson established the Sacred Heart Chapel in 1851. The weathered wooden building stood on a hill, overlooking a natural stopping point where weary pioneers would often pause to rest their oxen and bury their dead. To the passing travelers, the chapel was a representation of divine providence, a much-needed beacon of hope where they could find spiritual solace and, if necessary, a Christian burial for loved ones. The architects of deception. Father Murray, a tall, gaunt man in his 40s with piercing grey eyes and a commanding voice, had arrived in Oregon territory claiming to be a traveling missionary. His eloquent descriptions of his calling to serve the spiritual needs of westward-bound families, coupled with his genuine-seeming knowledge of Scripture, convinced even the most skeptical pioneers. He was accompanied by his devoted wife, who adopted the name Sister Constance. Her gentle demeanor and apparent medical expertise made her an invaluable resource for families struggling with sick children and dying relatives. The trio was completed by Brother Ezekiel, Murray's younger sibling, who would become synonymous with both damnation and salvation. While Murray possessed the natural presence of a leader, Ezekiel was the practical element, skilled with his hands, knowledgeable about livestock, and always ready to help struggling families repair wagons or tend to their animals. Together, the three crafted an image of profound Christian charity that inevitably drew desperate families in. The chapel itself was modest yet impeccably maintained, constructed from local timber with a small cemetery adjacent to the main structure. Inside, rough-hewn pews faced a simple altar adorned with a wooden cross, which Murray claimed to have carved himself. The building's most distinguishing feature was an unusually large basement, which the Graysons explained was necessary for storing supplies intended to help destitute travelers. Isolation and opportunity. The surrounding area was sparsely populated, consisting of a few scattered homesteads and a small trading post about 15 miles to the east. This isolation proved advantageous for the Graysons, reducing the number of witnesses to their activities and the likelihood of outside interference. Local settlers who had interacted with the family generally spoke highly of them, commending their generosity and sincere Christian devotion. After all, who else would commit their lives to ministering to dying strangers in the middle of nowhere? What made the Graysons exceptionally effective was their understanding of the trail's brutal realities. They were well aware that by the time families reached their location, many would be afflicted with serious illness, dwindling supplies, and the crushing psychological fatigue from months of hardship. They positioned themselves as the solution to these problems, not merely spiritual guides, but practical helpers offering medical care, supplies, and temporary shelter for those too weak to immediately continue. The question of denomination was irrelevant to desperate families. Whether Methodist, Baptist, Presbyterian, or any other Protestant faith, the Graysons tailored their approach accordingly. Murray was skilled in various Protestant traditions, able to quote scripture in whatever style offered the greatest comfort to his audience. This flexibility was vital on the frontier, where simple survival often superseded denominational differences. The first annihilation, the Morrisons. The first documented disappearance, though investigators would not piece together the timeline for decades, occurred on September 23, 1852. The Morrison family, James, his pregnant wife Elizabeth, their 3 young children, and Elizabeth's elderly father, had separated from a larger wagon train after reaching the Oregon Territory. Like many, they opted to press on alone toward their final destination, confident they could manage the remaining miles without the protection of the group. When the Morrisons' wagon suffered a broken axle just 2 miles from the Sacred Heart Chapel, it seemed like a miracle. James Morrison would later be recorded in territorial documents as saying the chapel appeared like a gift from the Almighty. Brother Ezekiel, who seemed to possess an uncanny ability to arrive precisely when travelers were in need, appeared at the broken wagon within hours of the accident. Brother Ezekiel said, with his characteristic slow, measured cadence, "The Lord has placed you near our humble chapel for a reason. Sister Constance has delivered many babies, and your Elizabeth looks ready any day. Father Murray would consider it an honor to offer sanctuary while you repair your wagon and prepare for the blessed arrival." The Morrison family gratefully accepted the invitation, moving into the small cabin the Graysons maintained adjacent to the chapel for just such purposes. For 3 days, everything seemed completely normal. Sister Constance attended to Elizabeth with gentle care, Brother Ezekiel assisted James with the wagon repairs, and Father Murray provided spiritual solace to the anxious family. The poisoned sanctuary. On the 4th day, things began to shift. Elizabeth's father, Samuel, was the first to fall ill, complaining of severe stomach cramps and nausea. Sister Constance attributed the symptoms to trail sickness, a catch-all term for the ailments plaguing travelers, and began administering what she called blessed remedies, prepared from herbs and other ingredients stored in the chapel's basement. "The Lord provides healing through nature's bounty," she would say while mixing her concoctions, "but sometimes the body must purge itself of toxins before the healing can begin." Within hours of taking Sister Constance's medicine, Samuel's condition deteriorated dramatically. His skin turned a grayish pallor, his breathing became labored, and he suffered violent episodes of diarrhea and vomiting. An alarmed James Morrison asked if they should seek help from the trading post to the east, but Father Murray advised patience. "Brother James," the preacher said, placing a reassuring hand on the younger man's shoulder, "I have seen this sickness many times on the trail. It must run its course. Moving Samuel now would surely kill him. We must trust in the Lord's timing and Sister Constance's healing gifts." By the 6th day, young Tommy Morrison, age 7, and his sister Mary, age 5, began exhibiting similar symptoms. Sister Constance worked tirelessly, preparing more remedies, administering what she termed purifying treatments, and maintaining a vigil over the increasingly sick family members. To James and Elizabeth, who were still healthy but exhausted from caregiving, the woman seemed like a saint sent by God. The horrific truth was that the blessed remedies administered with such apparent devotion contained carefully measured doses of arsenic. The Graysons had sourced the poison from local mining operations under the guise of pest control. The symptoms, stomach cramps, nausea, skin discoloration, and eventual organ failure, perfectly mimicked those of various trail diseases, making the murders virtually undetectable to grieving family members who had already witnessed extensive death on their journey west. The business of death. Samuel Morrison died on the 7th day, followed by Tommy on the 9th, and Mary on the 11th. Each death was accompanied by elaborate Christian rituals performed by Father Marai, who spoke movingly about the deceased joining their Heavenly Father. The remaining family members, overwhelmed by grief but grateful for the Graysons' spiritual support, never questioned the rapid succession of deaths. What they didn't know was that each night, after the survivors were exhausted from prayer and weeping, Brother Ezekiel systematically searched through the family's possessions, creating detailed inventories of every valuable item. The Morrisons had been relatively affluent back in Missouri, and their wagon held quality tools, fine furniture, family heirlooms, and a substantial amount of gold coins sewn into hidden pockets in James's clothing. On the 12th day, James Morrison himself began to experience the telltale symptoms. Elizabeth, now in the early stages of labor and terrified of losing her husband, begged Sister Constance to do everything possible to save him. The woman's response would later be recalled as particularly chilling. "My dear child," Sister Constance said, holding Elizabeth's trembling hands, "some illnesses are God's way of calling his children home. We must not question his wisdom. Only trust in his mercy. Your husband will join your precious babies in paradise, and you will raise your new child, knowing that your family awaits you in glory." James Morrison died on the 14th day, just hours before Elizabeth gave birth to a son who lived only long enough to be baptized by Father Marai. When Elizabeth succumbed to the same mysterious illness 3 days later, the entire Morrison family had been wiped out in less than 3 weeks. To any outside observer who might have inquired, the Graysons had a perfectly logical explanation. The Morrisons had arrived exhausted and ill, contracted a virulent form of dysentery, and died despite the best efforts of Christian caregivers. Father Marai had given them a proper Christian burial, and their possessions had been consecrated to the Lord's work, a pious-sounding euphemism for theft. The lessons learned and refined methods. The Morrison family's annihilation was only the beginning. The Graysons had made a horrific discovery: a murder, when executed with religious justification and sufficient planning, could be extraordinarily profitable. The success of their first family annihilation taught them valuable lessons that would shape their methodology for decades. Isolated families were easier targets than those in groups. The gradual onset of arsenic poisoning perfectly mimicked common trail ailments. Their religious authority granted them almost unlimited credibility with desperate, grieving people who needed someone besides God to blame for their suffering. Crucially, they realized the Oregon Trail provided a limitless supply of victims who would not be missed for months, if ever. The months following the Morrison murders were spent refining their operation with methodical precision. They established patterns and procedures. Brother Ezekiel became the scout, riding the trail to identify promising targets, families with obvious wealth, those traveling alone, or those already dealing with mechanical issues or illness. Sister Constance perfected her poisoning techniques, experimenting with different doses and delivery methods for maximum effectiveness and plausible deniability. Arsenic was easily disguised in herbal teas, medicinal tinctures, and even communion wine. Father Marai perfected the psychological manipulation needed to keep victims compliant, expertly adjusting his theological approach to fit the denominational background of his audience, e.g., emphasizing divine healing for Methodists, predestination for Presbyterians. The chapel underwent subtle changes to support their enterprise. The basement was expanded and divided, one section for storing victims' possessions, another for preparing arsenic solutions, and a third serving as a temporary morgue. They also dug a series of unmarked graves in a grove behind the chapel, which would eventually hold the remains of hundreds. The expansion of the enterprise. The winter of 1852 to 1853 allowed the Graysons time to prepare for the following year's killing season. They established relationships with black market dealers in larger Oregon settlements, men who asked no questions about the origins of the goods. Brother Ezekiel proved particularly adept, his honest face making his claims of selling for families who returned east or died of natural causes believable. By the spring of 1853, the Graysons had transitioned from amateur killers into professional predators with a sophisticated understanding of their deadly craft. Their second major success came in May with the Hoffman family, German immigrants who spoke limited English and traveled with a wagon laden with valuable possessions, including fine clockmaking tools and a substantial amount of gold coins. Their language barrier and foreign customs made them ideal, isolated targets. This time, Sister Constance began administering small doses of arsenic almost immediately, disguised as preventive medicine. The Hoffman family's murder took nearly a month to complete, an extended timeline that allowed the Graysons to thoroughly inventory their possessions and plan the disposal of the valuable trade goods. By the end of 1853, the Graysons had successfully murdered 3 complete families, totaling 16 people. They began to view their operation as a business, keeping meticulous records, the ledgers, that would later be discovered in a hidden compartment of the chapel basement. Written in Father Murray's precise hand, the entries treated human lives as inventory, detailing names, dates, possessions taken, disposal methods, and profits realized. The challenge of the Weatherbs. As word of the Graysons' charitable work spread, they began attracting victims who actively sought their help, walking directly into their trap. The methodical approach evolved further. Father Murray, with his analytical mind, began treating their work as a business that happened to involve murder. The summer of 1854 marked a crucial turning point with the arrival of the Wetherb family from Tennessee. Charles Wetherb, a former Confederate officer, was wealthy, but more significantly, he was intelligent and naturally suspicious. When their wagon developed problems near the chapel, Charles initially resisted the offers of assistance, uneasy about the isolated location and the convenient timing of Ezekiel's appearance. Father Murray, an expert at reading people, adapted his approach. Rather than pressing, he withdrew gracefully but casually mentioned that Sister Constance had noted signs of a regional sickness, like cholera or dysentery. The mention of disease had the intended effect on Margaret Wetherb, who was already exhausted and worried. When her younger brother, David, developed a mild fever the next day, the family's resistance crumbled. The psychological chess match. Charles's military training, however, kept him alert, making him a challenge. He watched everything and asked pointed questions. The Graysons adapted by providing carefully fabricated stories about previous successes, showing him the cemetery, pointing to graves they claimed belonged to already dying travelers, and even presenting forged testimonial letters from grateful families. The psychological manipulation was subtle but effective. By acknowledging Charles's suspicion and military background, Murray made him feel respected. By suggesting he would be a difficult target, the preacher made the possibility of being targeted seem remote. The actual murder of the Wetherb family took nearly 6 weeks, the longest timeline the Graysons had yet attempted. Sister Constance started with extremely small doses of arsenic disguised in blessed water, making the symptoms develop gradually and appear to be natural illness. Charles began noticing disturbing patterns, the fact that his daughters and he remained healthy while others sickened, the peculiar nature of the symptoms, and the Graysons' consistent presence during the worst moments. His suspicions climaxed when he found Brother Ezekiel examining the contents of his wagon late one night. A discovery too late. His fears were confirmed when, searching the chapel basement for medical supplies, he stumbled upon a hidden compartment containing possessions clearly belonging to other travelers, a child's doll, a pocket watch engraved with a name he didn't recognize, and a recent, unsent letter written by a woman describing her safe arrival at the chapel and thanking the Christian family for caring for her sick children. Charles realized he had discovered evidence of previous murders and that his family was being systematically poisoned. But his realization came too late. Margaret died that night, and Charles awoke the next morning feeling the familiar, dreadful symptoms. The Graysons had noticed his growing suspicion and accelerated his poisoning, with Father Murray slipping a massive dose of arsenic into his evening meal. As Charles lay dying, he made a desperate attempt to warn his twin daughters, but his words were dismissed as the ramblings of a fevered mind. The Wetherb case taught the Graysons key lessons. Intelligent victims required more sophisticated manipulation. Extending the murder timeline, while risky, made the crimes more believable and profitable. They needed better ways to manage victims who became suspicious. The discovery of evidence also led to improvements in disposal procedures. They began burning personal items, melting down jewelry, and creating more sophisticated hiding places. By the end of 1854, the Graysons had murdered 23 people in 7 families. They now saw themselves not as criminals, but as instruments of divine will, rewarded by God with their victims' possessions. The year 1855 marked a crucial turning point, bringing the Graysons' first major challenge, the survival of an intended victim who had witnessed enough to expose their entire operation.